Yeah, just I've got boundary.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session on international comparisons, Southern Africa and Latin America. The session is going to run from now till roughly 4:15. We've got 3 speakers. We've got a slightly unusual situation in that the first speaker, Miles Larmer of the University of Sheffield, who's going to be doing a talk on resource nationalism in Zambia's copper mining industry. He's unfortunately going to have to leave in the middle of the session. He's not going to be available for question time. By agreement, after he's finished his talk, I will permit 2 or 3 very narrowly focused points of information type questions. So if there's specific clarifications you want about the Zambian situation or about the paper, you can ask for them. But the main purpose of this discussion, the discussion to follow these talks, is comparative. So we don't want you to, at that point, to start the comparative discussion or to introduce any larger points you want to make. Okay, so apologies for that slightly unconventional format. The format's also unconventional in that we've got a third speaker, Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, who's from the University of Andes in Colombia, and he's going to be coming over to us on Skype. And yes, it's already visible to all of you. Okay, so I'm going to give each of the speakers 20 minutes. I'm going to try and enforce that fairly strictly. And I'm going to begin by just saying a little bit about the speakers. The first speaker is, as I've already indicated, Dr. Miles Larmer, Senior Lecturer in International History at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom, and a Research Fellow in the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's written extensively about Zambian history and politics. So that's Dr. Miles Larmer to my left. Then Richard Saunders is going to be doing the presentation after that. Dr. Richard Saunders is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at York University, Toronto in Canada, where he teaches African political economy and development. His current research is focused on questions of conflict minerals in the Southern African context and the emergence of regionalized political, economic and security networks in the mining sector. Richard asked me to mention that he's going to be hosting an author's workshop on Thursday and Friday for those involved in a book on Zimbabwean artisanal diamond mining. And although it's a closed workshop, he wanted me to say that anyone who has a specialized knowledge or interest in the area of diamonds in Zimbabwe is very much welcome to attend. So if you want to participate in that, speak to Richard. And then finally we will have Cesar Rodriguez Garavito. No doubt I've got the pronunciation wrong. Cesar is Associate Professor of Law and Founding Director of the Program on Global Justice and Human Rights at the University of the Andes in Colombia. He's a founding member of the Center for Law, Justice and Society. He has been a visiting professor at Stanford University, Brown University, the University of Pretoria, the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil, the Abo Academy of Human Rights in Finland, the Andean University of Quito, and the Irish Center for Human Rights. Serves on the editorial board of the Annual Review of Law and Social Science and writes regular columns and articles for El Espectador. So I also see that he's got a wide body of publishing work to his name, but I think in the interest of brevity, you'll just have to take my word for it that it's impressive. And we will proceed to the presentations. So we're going to start with Miles Larmer and his paper on resource nationalism in Zambia's copper mining industry. And Miles will speak for 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Gavin and to SWOP for the invitation, and apologies again for this rather problematic, unavoidable, I should stress, dash for the plane that I have to make later on. All I can say is it's much more frustrating for me than it is for you, for me to have to leave. I would love to stay for the rest of what I think is a fantastic event, and I would love to think that such an event we could do at some point in Lusaka, to have academics, practitioners, NGO people and mine workers together in one space. It would make a real contribution, as I think that SWOP and the organisers are doing today. It's a slightly historical paper, but I will keep the historical detail as brief as I can. Resource nationalism of one kind or another has, I think, been central to Zambia's existence as a colony and as an independent nation state over the last 80 years or so. For those who sought to overthrow colonialism in the 50s and early 60s, the mobilisation of mining labour for political purposes was a key weapon, and the use of mine revenue, copper mining revenue, would, it was imagined, fund national development. At independence, the new ruling nationalists established an uneasy but a meaningful alliance with international mining companies, including Anglo-American, ensuring expansion of the industry with the companies and the state taking a carefully negotiated share of what they assumed would be an ever-increasing cake of mining revenue. And that meant denying the demands of Zambian mine workers for significant improvements in wages and conditions, demands that they formulated as a reward for their role in the anti-colonial struggle and in relation to high global mineral prices. This led to major clashes between the state and mining unions and attempts by the state to end the autonomy of the labour movement. In the early 70s, the Zambian government responded to popular frustration with stalled post-independence transformation by 51% nationalising the mining sector. And it's an example of a deeply problematic nationalisation, a nationalisation that went coupled with, not coincidentally, the introduction of a one-party state, and was quickly followed by the global recession of the mid-1970s and a slump in mineral prices that endured until the end of the 20th century. And it really exposed the limited capacity of the state over mineral markets and the commodities central to their economies. And Zambia went from being a middle-income country to one of the world's poorest over the next 15 years. Organised labour played a significant role in the pro-democracy movements of the early 1990s, and trade union leader Frederick Chiluba became the country's second president in 1991. Eddie Webster and others have talked about the dual transition to political and economic liberalisation, and Chiluba presided over a really sweeping programme of economic liberalisation, a programme that substantially worsened Zambia's economic crisis, devastated the livelihoods of millions, amongst other things led to a halving in formal sector employment, halving of all formal sector employment, and in doing so considerably weakened the once powerful labour movement. In the late 1990s, the IMF and Zambia's donors pressured a reluctant government to sell off the strategic copper mining industry. It was done in a period of about 3 years in a thoroughly corrupt process. Then President Chiluba has been found guilty, at least in a London court, of corruption linked to the sale of the mines. Some mines were sold to asset strippers who caused the loss of thousands of further jobs. So by the early 2000s in Zambia, there was a kind of profound pessimism about the future of mining and mining communities. From the mid-2000s, Zambia experienced some economic recovery, some improvements in agricultural exports, tourism and so on. But the really significant economic growth that started from 2004-5, 5% annual growth from that point onwards, most years, resulted not from any economic diversification, but rather the dramatic rise in the international copper price quadrupling between 2003 and 6, new mines opening, significant exploratory development taking place. But the resultant vast profits made by the now privatised mining companies, and here I was very struck by what Dunbar was saying, there is a loss of this early relationship which very much parallels the Chamber of Mines type relationship with Western dominated companies like Anglo, Now we see investors from India, yes, from Australia and Canada, but also from China, a greater diversification of practice and position. What they have in common is the historically low proportion of mine revenue that accrues to the state, to workers and mining communities. And it's taxation, which is the fundamental issue which emerges. During the sell-off, the government and new mining investors signed entirely secret development agreements under which they paid 0.6% of their profits as royalties. So with rising prices, there's a sense of growing frustration that mining wealth results in little benefit either to the state or to ordinary Zambians. In 2005, Zambia received substantial relief of its international debt. It falls, I won't give you the figures, but essentially falls to a fairly manageable level, and it enables a policy debate for the first time in 30 years in which donor conditionality is not central to policy making. And there's an irony here. The achievement of debt relief through an outrageously swinging neoliberal programme, despite the IMF's praise for this programme, leads Zambians not to think that this is a really good way to run their economy, but precisely to take the opportunity of the removal of that debt to begin thinking about potential alternative models of development. So this is the context in which a new political force emerges in Zambian politics. The Patriotic Front Party, formed in 2001, got 2% of the vote that year. By 2006, in this transformed context that I'm trying to argue for, gets 29% of the presidential vote. And its leader, Michael Sata, does this by attacking directly the effects of privatisation, the sale of national assets to foreigners who do not have the nation's interest at heart. 2006 party manifesto claims, quote, "The main beneficiaries of the current regime, apart from the relatives and friends of politicians, are mostly foreigners. The ruling party's leaders have no conscience because they have not been moved by the plight and suffering of the Zambian workers, who have been reduced to daily casual employees in their own land, while foreign firms and consultants feast on their sweat and are diminishing natural resources." During the election campaign, Sata made strong rhetorical attacks on foreign investors, particularly those from China and India, which bordered on and occasionally amounted to outright abuse, racial abuse in some cases. And Chinese investment is, of course, a central question in much of Africa. Some argue it represents a new form of colonialism. Others see China's investment as acting strongly in the interests of Africans. And Zambia has been a major recipient of Chinese investment. Certainly there, Chinese companies have been associated with poor working conditions, dangerous working conditions. And in April 2005, 52 workers were killed in an explosion in a mining explosives plant owned by the Chinese company Bigarin. It's the country's worst industrial disaster for 30 years. It took them 5 days to work out how many people had been killed because these were casual employees. Think about it, in an explosives plant, nobody had a list of the workers working there, paid between $15 and $30 a month. And it struck me, thinking about this conference, that this was in some ways Zambia's Marikana moment. There was huge popular outrage and there was a sense of growing clarity about the position of the mine companies and their behaviour. More recently, there have been violent clashes at a coal mine in the south of Zambia. In 2010, Chinese managers opened fire with live rounds on workers. Last year, miners killed a Chinese manager at coal and the mine was subsequently closed down. In the mid-2000s, Sata put forward proposals which amounted to kinds of renationalisation, talking about that only 49%, only a quarter of future companies would be allowed to be privatised. And this created certainly an air of tension with some international investors. When Chinese President Hu Jintao visited Zambia in 2007, he had to cancel a planned visit to Chambishi, the town where the explosion took place, because of the fear of protests. Sata didn't win the 2000 election, but this set a mood of resource nationalism, and the then president introduced a windfall tax on mining profits, really just bringing Zambia into line with practice in many other places. It was extremely popular domestically, very unpopular with mining companies, but as in the midst of the 2007-8 recession, prices plummeted, workers were retrenched, the government succumbed to considerable international pressure and removed the windfall tax. Since then, the copper price has risen again, and it seems our sources from companies suggest that, in a way, they manufactured a crisis to resist this fairer level of taxation. Sata's PF increased its share of the vote, and in 2011 Sata was elected Zambian president. He had by then toned down the most virulent attacks on foreign investors. He claimed he wanted investors to act in the national interest, but this certainly didn't stop the hysterical mining press suggesting that this might be a new anti-capitalist government that would endanger the revival of African economies. Now, I've here characterised Sata as a populist rather than, if you like, a left-wing or socialist politician. A number of factors here, I think, that are important. He's a charismatic individual rather than being the head of a mass political party with a well-worked-through, ideologically informed programme. He uses vivid imagery, powerful rhetoric that alienates political classes but connects to the man or the woman on the street. He relies on morally constituted appeals to both supporters and opponents. Foreign companies are vilified for failing to have the interests of the common man at heart. And we can see that he varies his message from constituency to constituency. In northern parts of Zambia, he's not adverse to a bit of ethnic mobilisation that wouldn't work in the same way with urban populations. And his relationship to the labour movement is interesting. Certainly most trade unionists, certainly most Copperbelt residents strongly supported his party, but there's no formal alliance of the sort we can see here between the ANC and Casati. And now we've got a brief record of 18 months or so of Sata in government, so let me talk about that a bit. Sata didn't reintroduce the windfall tax, but the government doubled the tax on mine royalties from 3 to 6%. He attacked at taxing revenue rather than profits. Companies' ability to move foreign exchange entirely freely has been restricted by statutory instruments. The state has cancelled fuel and electricity subsidies to companies. Optimistic observers suggest a quietening in populist rhetoric alongside the specific implementation of some resource nationalist measures. Certainly the mine companies are unhappy, relations with the government are abrasive. But the real reality, and we come back to perhaps weak and strong states here, is that the state, after decades of decline, really does remain too weak to effectively hold companies to account, and at the same time largely disconnected from wider society that might enable the mobilisation of popular activism to assist them or pressure them in doing so. So it ends up with the ironic situation of the World Bank providing consultants to train mine department officials to forensically audit mines' production figures, revenue, profits, and so on. And any government attempt to challenge company figures is likely to be a major issue of future confrontation. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that high levels of tax on companies will see benefits accruing to mine workers or communities. While the government in the capital, Lusaka, seeks a larger share of the pie via tax reforms, miners and their communities experience a painful disconnect between what's happening at an elite level and what's happening in their communities. Kansanshi, the most profitable mine, the country's biggest taxpayer, has the workers living in the worst shantytown conditions and paying the highest rents. Mines' corporate social responsibility programs, unlike their more corporatist predecessors, maintain only the area around their mines. They're unwilling to provide the sort of social services provided in the past. And despite 8 years of mostly high, very high historically copper prices, huge profits being made, people's lives have hardly improved. A major strike wave hit the industry in the 2011-12 wage bargaining season, easily the biggest since privatisation, achieving mixed results, but I think the very fact that it took place was for the mine workers a step forwards, and I think it reflected an optimism surrounding Sata's election, the hopes that the new government would be more sympathetic to them. The government's visibility was noteworthy. The Minister of Labour and his deputy showed up in the mines when workers demanded 100% increments, independently of their union leaders. There were strikes, management refused, government officials put some weight behind the workers, and the Minister of Labour's support, Minister of Labour, a former trade unionist, won some praise. But of course, the government isn't a single entity. I think this is always important. Mine companies reported that the Ministry of Mine officials assured them the government would not interfere in the collective bargaining process. So the context in Zambia is that perhaps Sata has dragged Zambia back from the frontiers of free market fundamentalism, and its policies are perhaps coming to resemble more the South African government, certainly not to the left of that. As to the trade union movement, for many decades Zambia had a legally enforced policy of one union, one industry. And although this was designed to control unions, I've argued elsewhere that this actually had the unintended consequence of strengthening them, those who were discontented had to fight within the union to make change rather than walking away. Since the early 1990s, there's been a free market and competitive union organisation, and new unions have emerged that have recruited disillusioned members of the hitherto monolithic mine workers' union of Zambia, and there may be obvious parallels with South Africa here. To gain support, the new unions have taken more radical positions on pay demands and pulled large numbers of workers into them. You actually have situations where union members are moving almost on an annual basis between one union and another, depending on what the leaders promise. But at the same time, they're offering things like loan facilities. Unions have merged into this kind of role of loan providers, leading to, with microfinance companies, leading to significant problems with indebtedness. Mine workers complain about the weakness of all the unions, their inability to defend workers against dismissal, and it's also clear that multiple unions sometimes enable companies to sow divisions between them by playing them off against each other. A major issue since privatisation, I know is a concern here as well, is the universal use of subcontracting large sections of work, fragmenting the organising capacity of unions, and a new union of contractors workers has recently been formed, but many contractors refuse to recognise it. Workers are fearful of joining. What we've seen in the last few months is, although I think PF still has a strong residue of support amongst mine workers and communities, it feels like this isn't enough. So we see discontented expression expressed in strikes, but also in a spate of riots on the Copperbelt, only some of which are linked to labour protests. And briefly, I think another major area of interest, Zambia, again, like the old Chamber of Mines that Dunbar was talking about, dealt with the land problem by a colonial administration which effectively fenced off the mines and said, that's for you. Now we see new greenfield sites being developed in Zambia's northwestern province, and here we see something which hasn't been experienced there before but is familiar elsewhere: societal tensions within local communities over potential spoils. We see chiefs benefiting from mining investments, newly built palaces, four-wheel drive vehicles. Others have sought to negotiate a share of jobs in the mine for their kith and kin, for their local communities, and that's led to tension with incoming miners coming from outside. I think there's a very interesting, the political dynamic, political rhetoric around what was described as the new Copperbelt in northwestern province was that it would be diametrically different to the old. The old Copperbelt was associated with nationalisation, labour militancy, and the new one would be shiny and new. And of course what's happened is almost all the old social problems have come with the development of mining. It's the old story that to develop mines, one needs to engage with communities, one needs to recruit workers, and social concerns, or as far as the companies are concerned, social problems arrive with that. We've certainly seen chiefly disputes in which governments have intervened, which are directly related to the value of surface rights with companies. Okay, I need to stop, so let me just think of a few key points. Mining has been far more dominant in Zambia's economy than even in South Africa's. It's been responsible for 80 or 90% of GDP and formal sector economic employment, at least during the periods when the mines have been profitable. Its spoils, its results, its potential have been fiercely contested by mine companies, the state, workers and communities. An income that accrued to the state did of course not necessarily benefit ordinary Zambians. Its distribution depended on a range of primarily political factors, including crucially the extent of not formal democracy but functioning democratic accountability. Nationalisation in the 70s didn't deliver to the Zambian state effective control of this key resource, but privatisation in the late 1990s certainly provided an opportunity for, frankly, a criminal devastation of parts of the industry and workers' lives. PF emerged as a powerful populist nationalist force when the mines became profitable and when it became possible to envisage again a redistributive developmental state. Zambia doesn't yet have such a state. PF is not, the ruling party is not decisively committed to the redistribution of political and economic power. But I think at the very least we've seen a step back from the worst excesses of neoliberalism, and I think in these kind of situations there is cautious optimism that the situation, the conditions arise in which mine workers might make such demands in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Well done for finishing exactly on 20 minutes. Right, so as I explained earlier, I'm now going to allow a handful of very tightly focused informational questions about Zambia, because this is not the opportunity for the main comparative discussion or to make larger points. So are there any quite specific questions that people want to ask? Yes, I've got one there.
Sorry, where?
Oh, sorry,
Oh, no, sorry, I'm just handing out the mic.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, once again, the question I want to ask about Zambia is that we know very well that in the 1970s, when Zambia nationalized the mines, they actually gave management contracts to the guys who were running the mines before its owners, which then creates a principal agent problem. And in the current discourse around the developmental state, Joseph Stiglitz makes it very clear that one of the challenges of the principal agent problem, particularly in terms of privatization, is that the current managers, they have a tendency to undervalue assets, so that if they know that there's an opportunity for privatization, then they get again what belongs to the state.